Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We are your hosts, Marlena, Cheri, and Matthew. We are therapists and coaches, and we want to share our own stories with you, as well as the wisdom, insights, and tips we've learned along the way. Thanks for tuning in to this episode. Welcome to the Happy in the Mess podcast. We started this discussion because there are so many challenges to being a human today. We want to offer you, our listeners, our observations, insights, and advice from our expertise as mental health counselors and coaches. We have with us today Marlena, our dating and relationship coach, Matthew, the misfit coach, and myself, Cheri, a couples relationship coach. Today, we're talking about managing your emotions, what to do when your emotions try to hijack your choices. All right, let's just dive in. I want to start with a simple question. What are emotions and how do they affect our lives? Matthew, you want to weigh in on that first?
Sure, I can do that. So emotions are they're feelings. They're what's going on in your mind that, has there's body sensations to it. There are ways that we frame our lives. One of the examples I use a lot with this is the movie Inside Out, which I think gives you a great understanding of emotions because it personifies them. And it's a little bit older movie now, but still valid. It's one of my favorite ones as a therapist and a coach to go through, because you have all these characters within the human brain. You have anger, you have joy and sadness, and they all have these very distinct personalities, and they're all valid. They all have this voice, but yeah, and what we're going to talk about today, right? Every once in a while, they get a little bit crazy and they start to run over each other. So I think that's to me, that's always been the way I frame emotions. So, Marlene, I don't know if you have a different take on that.
No, I mean, pretty similar. I think the primary ones you've listed, I think I'd add fear to that. We talk about anger, joy, sadness, fear, and am I missing one? One of the big ones?
Yes. Disgust is the one they
And
use in.
disgust.
Yes.
Yes, and disgust. And we call them feelings because we feel them. They sit in the body, and a really lovely way to start understanding our emotions are to notice those sensations you talked about, and locating where they are in and are all in our bodies, and that's helpful to start processing them and moving through them.
Yeah, we intuitively know what emotions are. You don't have to ask, like a small child knows what an emotion is. But when you try to break it down, it's much harder to give a good definition. Now, the only thing I would add to that is that the emotions themselves are not good or bad. They're really just a marker that your body is saying, hey, pay attention, something important is going on. So then we have to pull that back, set it next to the facts so that we can decide what to do with that emotion. So, why do our emotions get out of hand and what's the cost when they do?
I think one reason they get out of hand is because they tend to be a little layered. And I think they really get out of hand when we start judging ourselves for the primary emotion that we have. Oh, I shouldn't be feeling sad. I shouldn't be feeling angry. Now we start feeling shame, and then they get a little distorted. I think that's one reason where we go a little awry with our emotions, is judging that we have them to begin with.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes that I love that should. I think should really does fuel a lot of this. But I think too, they get out of hand when we start to take them at face value, that they're the only, like if any one of these parts becomes the only voice. With Inside Out, the challenge is that joy thinks that, more or less thinks that she's the valid emotion. And when sadness starts to get out of control, she freaks out because it infringes on her territory. And so she basically spends the entire movie creating her own disaster and then trying to fix it. And I think that happens a lot with us, is we get one emotion that suddenly gets this super, super strong voice, and we think that that's the only one, rather than treating it like, our emotions are a committee. We have a variety of them, and they all lean in onto each other and balance each other for that.
That's a great example. The movie itself is just a perfect personification of it. So that's really helpful to think about it that way. I would add that a lot of times the emotions get out of hand because we try to push them away.
Mhm.
A big emotion comes and we're like, that I don't want to be feeling that. So I'm just going to set that aside. And what happens is that starts to build up and then becomes it kind of hijacks everything.
Or others push it them aside. I mean, sometimes when we're uncomfortable with other people's feelings, we sort of only accept or want to see certain ones. And so we get kind of sort of pigeonholed into like anger is the only thing acceptable that I can show. So that's what I'm just an example. That's what
Mhm.
I'm going to show because I know other people will be okay with that one. Perhaps anger is not the best example, but it is true that we have trouble validating the spectrum of emotions of ourselves and of others. And that's too when they start to get a little crazy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm going to bounce a little bit off script because that really hit Marlena. Wow. And especially as a male, I think, and the stereotypical male, I think a lot of us, and old one as well, but I think a lot of us were raised with this idea that anger is an acceptable emotion. You can go out and on a sports field and hit somebody really hard, or, just growl and like, oh, that's a boy being a boy. Like it's what they do. Rather than admitting like, hey, we have these other feels, and we can cry, and we can be sad, and we can be jealous, and we can be frustrated, and we can be happy, and like all of those are okay.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, a lot of times going to that idea that everything gets squished into one valid emotion.
Mhm. And it's so true for men, and I often hear from the women that I counsel and coach that anger is not acceptable for them to show, and so
Hmm.
they isolate themselves and they start accepting unacceptable behavior in their lives from others because there is no expression for their anger. I love anger in particular because it's a good indication our boundaries have been broken. And I always try to encourage my clients to be like, anger's there for a reason. What is it teaching you? What is it showing you? What boundary do you need to make with this one?
Oh, that's a
So,
great thought of like the anger indicates something, and so pay attention to that.
mhm.
I would agree about both the men and the women. I think women also get a very strong message that we're supposed to smile, be happy,
Mm,
just absorb it.
Yeah.
So
mhm,
that's also not a helpful message. All right,
mhm.
so let's talk about how people manage their emotions in unhealthy ways and how that affects the person when they just don't deal with those emotions.
Well, I think one that it really comes to mind when especially when we're talking about, trauma, is the fight, flight, or freeze response. But also they've added appease, which I have totally been guilty of. Is this I'm going to people please or appease the person because I don't know how else to cope with this, and I need to diffuse what's happening immediately. So those are some extreme ways that I think emotions can come out when we're not when we're kind of caught off guard and in fear in particular.
Mm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think a lot of times sometimes we look at, is this a healthy or an unhealthy coping mechanism too? But fight, flight, freeze, appease, like those are all, they're valid. They're needed in certain occasions. I always say, you don't want to reason with the bear that's chasing you. There,
You
there's
don't?
no reason to,
No.
to sit and talk to him and try to logic this thing out. The goal is pick one, fight, flight, freeze. I don't know if appease works with the bear, but if have a jar of honey or something, try it. I saw that on a nature documentary, or Winnie the Pooh or something. I don't know. Um, but the ADHD moment. So, right. But there's like, some of these are really valid, but a lot of times they can be in unhealthy quantities or unhealthy timing of things. So when I'm working with clients, a lot of times it's, it might be okay to withdraw for a little bit and really to get your feelings sorted out. But then we find ourselves starting to spend hours doing whatever our compulsive behavior is. As a gaming nerd, I'm one of those that, yeah, I have spent an unhealthy amount of time in gaming worlds, and it's like they're okay for a little bit, but not for that much, right? Or when work-life balance starts to be challenged, and you're not spending time with family, or you're not spending time with work because you're doom scrolling TikTok for 3 hours. I don't know what the cutoff is, but I'm pretty sure three is well over the limit for most. So,
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to say too, sometimes those fight, flight, freeze, appease responses make really a lot of sense if you are actually faced with a wild animal, for example. But a lot of times, like those responses are coming out in situations that it's not really appropriate to the situation. And it's so sort of distorted in that way. I would say, to back up what you were saying, Matthew, that one of the other things I noticed with compulsive behaviors, I mean, it can be eating, gaming is a great example. I think drinking, using drugs, like all these ways to escape the feeling, or find some sort of quick relief. I know that I used alcohol for many years. It was just a real quick and easy, and it worked. And it's like, why wouldn't you do the thing that you know works? Like a bag of Oreos works. Like, it doesn't
And
have
it works quickly.
Yeah.
You don't have to wait or build up to that.
And that's part of the challenge of humaning. Like, how do we tolerate our emotions long enough so that we end up being able to process and feel the feelings and not feel so overwhelmed and feel like we're going to die? I used to feel like I was going to die if I let myself feel my feelings, which is obviously not the case. It's no wonder I went to a bottle if I felt like I was going to die. It's almost like there's almost like no choice sometimes when you're so unskilled with feeling the feelings. We turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms because they work quickly.
It's really easy to point out the really toxic, unhelpful coping mechanisms, but I think the numbing ones are actually the ones that we all go to. It's sitting in front of the TV and zoning out. You're not really engaging or getting anything from that. Social media, the same thing, where you lose hours, you don't connect with anyone, you don't learn anything. And you get to the end of these numbing things and you feel the same way that you did at the beginning. There's no sense of I'm refreshed or this has rejuvenated me.
And sometimes you feel worse, and tiredness takes over. And then, have you all heard the phrase "halt, hungry, angry, lonely, tired"? I mean, yep, that when we ignore and numb, I mean, we just get more and more into that place of halt.
Yeah, that cost is emotional. It affects our relationships. It affects our health. Like really having these negative coping strategies when you feel overwhelmed with an emotion, it just pervades our whole lives.
Absolutely, Cheri.
And I think one of the things, as I'm thinking about this, one of the things I hear, so here's this extra emotional piece that jumps in that we haven't talked about. This is where shame comes in a lot of times, because then we end up in this spiral of, oh, I can't do this without the bag of Oreos, or, the video game, or, whatever our chosen vice is, which then causes us, I think, a lot of times to pull into this dark spot and not reach out for help. And it just folds in on itself. So it becomes unhealthy coping for unhealthy coping for unhealthy coping, and that numbing and shutting down happens.
That isolation and increased loneliness, which can increase distrust, I found, like those feelings. The more you isolate and become lonely, the more you distrust others and the less likely you become to reach out. And Brene Brown talks about this too. How do we dismantle shame? Is actually, if there's nothing really to be shameful about, if we're not really fearing being ostracized from the community, that to talk about it, which is why 12-step groups and other groups can be so helpful. In talking to a therapist and a coach is because you get to let out the thing that's causing you shame, and then you get to hear that it's okay, that this is kind of normal. I mean, that you're not going to be judged for it.
Yeah, that segues us right into what are the positive ways of managing emotions. And then how does it affect your life when you have these healthy coping strategies?
Yeah. And I'll jump in if it's okay. Like one of the things, and I'm going to get totally nerdy, so my apologies to everybody, but this is my jam clearly, and this is what I do. But so one of the examples I use with my clients a lot of times is the Starship Enterprise from Star Trek, because depending on the iteration and which version we're on, you have a crew, and the crew has all very distinct voices. And I'm of the generation where Next Generation was the big thing, and so you have Worf, who's the battle hardened Klingon, and every time you have a problem, it's okay, what can we do to shoot it, stab it, kick it, punch it, whatever it is. Like his is always, and it's a little oversimplified for those who are truly within that universe, but like that's that nature. And we have this, a lot of times we have this nature saying, hey, I need to fight this. But we can't let that run the show. We can't, if Worf gets, command, that's what he's going to do in that stage, right? Counselor Troy is going to be the empath, and she's going to want to love and, work her way through everything. And sometimes we need that butt kicking moment. So I think, to me, when you're talking about how to handle valid emotions, it's to sit and listen to them, and it's to actually feel it, and to have it take root and see what it particularly needs in that situation, and ask, like, is this healthy? Is this unhealthy? If it's unhealthy, then what else can we do? Right. Using that bag of Oreos, right? Why do I need the Oreos? Well, because I'm sad. Well, what else can we do, for sadness? Right. Will one Oreo be okay? Can we do it in a healthier quantity? Or, hey, let's go take a walk instead, and then see if we want the Oreos afterwards.
I like that, kind of redirecting yourself as
Mhm.
you pay attention to the emotion and ask, like, why is it? Also, I like this is going to some internal family systems work, again, locating where is it in my body. I feel the feelings because I feel them. Where are they? And then in having a dialogue with the emotion, like, what are you trying to communicate with me? And then what is it that feeling needs? And that gives me a little bit of separation from the feeling so I don't become so blended with it. I am not sad. I am having a feeling of sadness. And just that, like, so I can start witnessing the sadness and have some compassion for it without becoming the sadness, if that makes sense.
That
And that gives me,
that
sorry, go ahead.
IFS framing works so well with the movie Inside Out.
Mhm.
I would add that we have to process those emotions, and we either process them intentionally or they get processed unintentionally. And so it's much better to recognize that sadness and then decide what to do with it so that you convert it into something more positive. And sometimes that's going for that walk. Sometimes it's talking to another person or journaling, but sometimes it's actually moving that out of your body with movement, exercise, artwork, where you're converting it into something else.
I would
Mhm.
add breath work too is a big one that I personally lean on in meditation, pranayama and meditation, so that it's like the time in my day I allocate just to breathing allows me to, like, circle, like, not circle, but cycle through my emotions. It's almost like a washing machine for me. I feel like I'm going through the washing machine, I'm getting cleaned. Like the things are coming and they're going. And it's just a really lovely way for me to get through and process the emotions of the day. I remember one time, quick little example, I had volunteered at a homeless shelter back in grad school, and there's just so much tragedy in in those places and the stories you hear. And I sat down to do my meditation. I did an overnight stay, and in the morning I woke up and I did my meditation, and I just bawled. I mean, it was all like stored in there, and I just needed to let it out. And had I gotten busy with the rest of my day, it probably would have come out in some weird way sideways if I didn't let myself just have the moment to cry and be like, this was very sad. This was sad. And I
Mhm.
needed to express it.
Yeah. Working with highly sensitives, I'll use the analogy of a sponge a lot of times, where our nature is to be a sponge. And so if we're in a homeless shelter, we're going to sponge up those stories and those feelings, and we absorb it. And there's it all comes in, and sometimes they get lost. Sometimes those feelings bounce against our other stuff. Right. And with a sponge, you have to squeeze it out. You have to let the emotions out, because otherwise they sit in there and they get funky.
Mhm.
And I always tell people too that, it's a twofold process, because if I wipe off the counter and just squeeze the sponge and sit it on the back, my wife will be very, very angry with me. Because she points out that it's still nasty, and so one of the things is to get that under the clean water. So I think a lot of times we manage our healthy emotions by letting ourselves feel and experience the healthy ones, that the happy ones are what we're wanting to feel. Um, because again, everything has a voice, and we don't want to ignore, but we also want to keep everything balanced well.
Mhm.
Yeah, I'm
I love
thinking
that.
about I'm thinking about in relationships when you stuff down those emotions and then there's that temptation to like blast it out on someone else and how
Mhm.
that's still processing it, but it's processing it in a way that's going to hurt you and hurt that relationship and hurt the other person.
Mhm.
Mhm. That's why I think the spiritual traditions or practices, the prayer and meditation, that finding stillness and allowing yourself some stillness is so important. I've heard people say, I don't like to practice meditation because when I get still, I begin to cry. And I'm like,
Mm.
yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you let yourself do that, it will end. And I think that we forget, like, this too shall pass. And I think in DBT we teach, emotions only last about, I think, 30 seconds. We
Oh,
make them last longer because we hold on to them.
Mhm.
Like, and if we just learn to let go, like process, like get that through movement or breath or prayer, meditation, like let it have its say, then they actually pass, and then 30 seconds will only really be 30 seconds and not days.
Mhm.
that's great.
That is-
So, what are your favorite ways to work through emotions? You personally, what do you do?
Like I shared before, I meditate almost regularly. It helps me usually not make rash decisions or act on impulses because I am pent up with emotion. And I actually have a couple mentors that I talk to regularly beyond actually my own therapist, where I say, especially when I'm having a feeling I sense is going to cause me harm, I'm real quick to pick up the phone and be like, hey, this is happening. And I recently got into IFS, so I do enjoy kind of finding those trailheads, as you talk about, the sensations in the body, and sitting with it and talking to it and being like, what is it that you need from me? And being willing to give myself what I need. And sometimes it's just a good cry, and then I can get up and go about my day.
Mhm.
Great. Matthew, what about for
That's
you?
awesome. Yeah. I love, you were talking Brene Brown earlier. And one of the things she says, is if we share our stories with someone who can respond with love and empathy, then shame cannot survive.
Yeah,
It's
I love that.
one
Yeah.
of my favorite quotes. Now I think for me, because I take a neurodivergent approach, I was actually talking with a client about this yesterday because we were trying to work through some feelings with words. And we realized that a lot of us don't think in words. We think in images and pictures. I was One of the things we talk about is, how do you respond to somebody with text messages? Because sometimes it's words, and sometimes we use the animated GIFs. And I love, like, once those things started, I was like, oh, I'm hooked on this because that's the way my brain actually works. So talking through things get muddled. So for me personally, I have to process in a lot of nonverbal ways. So for me, I lean a lot on my music. That's my
Yes.
meditation because there's body sensations with it. It's grounding,
Mhm.
but I can also work through emotions. I know when my mom passed, I picked up Louis Capaldi's "Someone You Loved," and that was my, like, I'm just going to work this out and I'm just going to cry because it's such a beautiful emotive song because there's an anger component, there's a sadness component, there's a loss. It really wraps grief up well.
Mhm.
If I just need to burn off stress, I go so 90s cliche, and Four Non Blondes, What's Up? It's just, that's one of those, just build out the emotions. If I'm nostalgic, I go with Dougie MacLean's Caledonia because it's, again, they're emotive songs. Now, I think one of the balances I always caution people too is you want to lean into the emotion, but not tip the bike over onto it.
Mhm.
So a lot of times if I find myself getting too fixated, which is, as a neurodivergent, happens, then I have to find either something to counterbalance that or just get out of the music altogether and go into something crafty, something with my hands, because clearly I'm a hands person. Um, but again, I think it all boils down to just letting myself feel it.
Mhm.
So
I think too, I mean, back to the movement piece, and what Matthew's saying about neurodivergent, I'm thinking about highly sensitive people and how they can actually overdo it
mm,
sometimes with movement. I find that, like, I have been able to, like, run myself into the ground with movement and then just start crying because I've, like,
mm,
overdone it. And it's like it would started out with a good intention, but it went too far. I mean, I think I can take any of these practices too far, and it's everything in moderation.
Yeah.
yeah.
I think I rely a lot on relationships and words. So my go-to is to vent with another person or talk it through. My two of my daughters have moved out just a couple months ago, and it's been really hard for me to process the grief and the loneliness. So there have been days that I just said, this is my day to cry. I'm not a huge crier, but I just had to accept that, like, this is how my body is going to let this out, and just go through my day and know that I might be tearful, and that's okay, and just letting that out.
Mhm.
All right. Any final thoughts or tips that you want to leave people with today?
Well, related to music, I think poetry is a great way because I mean, poetry is music without the
Mhm.
music. Yeah, and so that's another way that I've used in the past and still use to process emotions and help me identify what it is I'm actually feeling. Just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Borrowing from other people's processing is always okay. It's, it allows us to, I think, assimilate and sometimes just get our own stuff out. Kind of you know, I grew up in the 80s mixtape era when, rather than tell somebody I love you, I'll put 20 different songs on it. Well, not really, 9 different songs on a cassette tape. And
Yeah, I love
the
that.
the
Yeah.
younger audience people will have to look up what all that means, but that's okay.
I
There's
think now
Google
they share their playlist.
playlists. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And yeah, and I would say too, oh my goodness, I lost my train of thought. Oh, back to what you said about Brene Brown and having someone trusted to talk to you and you, Sherry, with relationships, like this idea that, don't go to the hardware store for bread. There's some people who may not be able to validate the experience that you're having, or because they're uncomfortable, which is just a reflection of where they are with their own ability to experience their own feelings. It's not a reflection of where you are, or there's something wrong with you because you're having the feelings. But if I say my hair's on fire and they say, what do you mean? It's not helpful. So finding those trusted people, like who will validate, because once you validate the feeling, it will pass faster.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And Sherry, you earlier, you said something that was a gem, and I think this is a whole next episode. Because you talked about, when a spouse comes home and emotes all over the place, right? What do we do? And like my initial inclination at that point was like, oh, I need to ask more about this, but I think that's probably like an entire episode in itself.
Yeah, that is our next topic. Next time we meet, we're going to be talking about emotions and how that affects other people. So you guys can all look forward to that conversation. All right. Any new projects either of you want to talk about, or where can people find you?
You can go to coachmarlena.com for me. I've just put out a new dating profile checklist to help people make the best of their online profiles, best foot forward, so that they don't have to be on the apps as long. So go to coachmarlena.com to get that free checklist.
That's awesome. I'm at misfitrefuge.com. I just finished up I think I'm at 16-page workbook on just some of the traps that we fall into as a misfit and how to become more comfortable with ourselves and develop our own self-confidence, self-esteem through that.
Well, those are great offerings. I'm Cheri Timko. I'm at cheritimko.com. I am in the process. I have been redoing my website, which will be much better for other people when they come and see that it makes sense, because it had gotten a little bit tangled up. So that's where you'll find both my free offerings and other options. All right.
Excellent.
Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.